Hi, this is Peter Teuscher. Thanks for joining us for another podcast. I'm here with Tobi Dempker, who I usually join for these podcasts and enlightening conversations. We pick a topic and see where the conversation takes us. It's usually something to do with personal development, professional development, or even a little bit of philosophy. So how are you doing today, Tobi?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. I was just thinking, yeah, who's joining who? I feel like I'm joining you, but and that's besides the point. Thanks.
Yeah, it's just I just happen to be the one doing the recording here, but we have a mutual come together. Equal. It's an equal partnership.
That's like coaching should be.
Absolutely. So, Tobi, you've got a great conversation piece for us today. What are you thinking about today?
Yeah, sure. Well, I realized that one of the things that I really, really enjoy with coaching and these kind of conversations is when you have the opportunity to just explore different perspectives. So I thought we could have a chat about that. What does that mean to explore perspectives, and perhaps what are some different ways to do it, right? Because I think I've said that maybe a few times in our conversations that when I view the power of coaching or the power of the pause or whatever you want to call it, I have a very clear picture of a ball in front of me which is centered, and I can view that from different perspectives, right? So it's about taking that stop, but then what does this look like from the side or from the other person's point of view, or from above, or what does it look like when you're looking in the details, or if you zoom out. And there's a real power and it's such a strong resource when you're able to just change the perspectives and explore, well, what it does it look like from this way. So I thought we could yeah, see how to do that.
Yeah, I think that's actually a valuable discussion to have because it's as easy as it sounds to try and see things from different perspectives. I think it's something most people find challenging. Maybe not all the time, but from time to time. Certainly, when we're very invested in a topic and we want to get our point of view across, or when things get very emotional, we experience the world, our lives, through our personal particular vantage point, and it's
Mm,
not always easy to put yourself in the shoes of other people or to try and see things from the way that you've mentally constructed it. The sort of practiced way of seeing things is the thing that we jump to, and it's not always easy to get out of that. It can
mm,
be an element of our comfort zone. So yeah, I think that's a valuable conversation to have.
mm,
Yeah, and definitely one that's relevant for coaching, because I think in coaching, one of the things we look at sometimes is just reframing. Reframing a situation can
mm.
can all of a sudden completely resolve an issue, or really give clarity to a solution, right? Just by
Yeah, for
simply
sure.
reframing.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, I think there's a lot of way. It sounds really easy. We'll just change the perspective, and then we'll see what it looks like. But as you're saying, a lot of the things come in the way. I mean, it's either that we're super busy and we're with hands-on things, and we're kind of just looking into the details and feel overwhelmed by the task at hand, or an emotional part as well that you just mentioned. That I'm so attached to this emotion that this is my perspective is correct, or that this is the way that it should be, or so it's not, we're kind of being hijacked, so to not be able to explore any kind of different perspectives.
Yeah,
Mm,
absolutely. I think, well, actually the fact that you've brought this up now is interesting. I was doing a 3-day workshop last week with a leadership team,
mm,
and we did a segment on communication, and it's so interesting that communication really needs this skill of changing perspective, because we were talking a bit about nonviolent communication, and
mm,
you talking about things in terms of, first of all, your first step is to observe what's going on. What can I
mm,
see without any judgment? So,
mm,
what can I see without jumping to a conclusion about it? And also observing what's happening within yourself, right? So, trying to observe both of those things independent of each other, or at the same time, can be really really challenging, right?
mm,
So So I think, you can see things through your own perspective, and even there's different vantage points, right? So you can be, if you can take the emotion out of something, you can see things through different eyes already, right? And so I think within communication, I think it's a really, really important tool because, as the psychologist who developed nonviolent communication, Marshall B. Rosenberg, he had this belief that we all have the ability to have empathy and compassion, right? So I think those are probably two important ingredients, right? When we're trying to see things from different vantage points, especially where human relationships are concerned, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess when you're mentioning the words of empathy and compassion, that brings alive a certain curiousness to at least try to understand a different perspective. So what might this look like from another person's point of view? And just being interested in that I guess that would be one of the first steps, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want to have productive communication and you want to try and be able to understand the person you're talking to, I mean, one of the most important communication skills is listening. So, trying to listen without, and you and I both know this in coaching, trying to listen without looking for the solution, right? A lot of people, a lot of men tend to be, and not to generalize, but men tend to be fixers. This is one complaint you hear from women is he doesn't just listen. He's jumping to the solution and trying to fix the problem, sort of thing. So that's something I've tried to. Well, I think I've been helped through years of coaching. To not take on that other person's problem, but just to listen. And then when I'm asked to give it. So listening is, I think, a really important piece about exploring another perspective, because when you listen carefully and you pick up on the emotion and sort of the words that are using to describe a situation, it really helps you then put yourself in that other person's shoes, or to try and see things from their vantage point. Because sometimes the reason that people have trouble communicating or coming to some kind of consensus or finding a win-win, a big reason is because they feel like the other person is just so far removed. Their opinions, their views, their worldview is so far removed from their own that there's just no way they could find any common ground. And I think, if you don't make any effort, if you're not willing to at least empathize or have some compassion for that other person's view, even if you feel like, well, it's totally fear-driven, or it's been distorted by some dogmatic view of the world or whatever, but you can probably, with enough compassion and empathy, you can probably at least understand how they came to that conclusion, even if you disagree with it, right? And I think that's a really important place to start from.
Yeah, sure. And also, I mean, with the listening part, that it allows for different kinds of perspectives to emerge. When we talked about empathy and compassion, it's kind of interesting to see, well, what does this look like from the other, basically 180 degree kind of angle, right? So what is the other perspective? But what are the other areas? Like what would the client think? What does the customer say? What does the provider say? What would the chairman say of the board? That's just a few examples, right? But just being able to explore and let other perspectives emerge, I think that's it. So there's a lot of, maybe what I'm saying is that there's a lot of space there, and there's a lot of different ways that we can do this, and a lot of questions to be asked. And one of those questions that really intrigued me lately was, I forgot how it came up, but the question is, well, what would you tell yourself, your 10-year-old self? Like, so imagine if you had a chance to have that conversation. And I thought about that, but then I realized that for me, the much more interesting question would be, well, what would he say to myself now? Like, so that perspective on things. Well, what would my 10-year-old self tell me? For me, that's much more interesting.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
I could dig into that, right? But
Well, I was just going on, mentally. I was going off on the direction of when people are having a heated debate, and one of the ways you prepare for a debate is you can try and steelman the argument. So you basically argue their perspective to understand their perspective, right?
mm,
And
mm,
so that's one thing. But what you're bringing up there is interesting because I've been listening a lot to Gabor Mate. He's actually a Canadian from Vancouver, same city as me,
mhm,
where I'm from. But he's he went from being a medical doctor to working with a lot of addiction and so on, and now sort of focus more on the psychological side and helping people recover from trauma. I think anybody who's had anything to do with trauma, he's a guy that you should look into because he's very insightful on this on the topic. But
mm,
in listening to the way he talks to people, he'll people will people who've suffered trauma and then they tell themselves it's no big deal, toughen up, or whatever,
mm,
it's not really that bad, or all these things we tell ourselves to push through the trauma rather than dealing with it. And the way he approaches it was kind of like what you just mentioned is, one of the things he says he does with people who have kids, right?
mhm,
Or ask them to imagine they had kids. And he would say, so if this happened to your child, who would you want them to come and talk to? And obviously say, well, me, right? So
mm,
if I, with one of your two kids, if they had something bad, traumatic happen to them,
mm,
who would you hope that they talk to, right? And they
mm,
hope it would be you.
mm,
And so would you tell your kids, toughen up, it's not
mm,
that bad?
mm,
You would show compassion, right?
mm,
And so he's just pointing to the fact that we're willing to do it for other people, and people we love a lot, like people who are really close and important to us, like our kids. We would never try and make excuses for why something happened. We would address their feelings. We would encourage them to express their feelings, and so
mm,
so that change of perspective from this is the way you would deal with someone you really care about, like your child, versus the way you deal with yourself, right? And I
mm,
think that's a really powerful shift and change of perspective when you can see things through. I talk about this with people too that I coach privately, where I talk about self-parenting, right?
mm,
So if you yourself were a parent, and how would you treat that child, and and try and look at it from that perspective of and really treat yourself the same way. So you would, you give for people who have trouble with, I don't know, self-control or discipline, I'm not a big fan of the discipline word, as you know,
mm,
but how would a parent go about that if you were parenting yourself, right? And so that's kind of, and that's why all these tools that we use as coaches, because sometimes when you're stuck in the middle of the problem, you can't see the solution because
mm,
you can't see the forest for the trees.
yeah,
And so that's why the whole exploring different perspectives is so interesting for me as well, because taking people out of their current view of things and getting them to look at it from another angle is so beneficial. It just opens people's eyes, and all of a sudden you see the proverbial light bulb go off over their head, right? So
yeah, yeah, and it's a very strong, exactly. It's a very strong emotion when you realize that. It's like, okay, well, it could be this as well. I've never thought about that. That's a very good kind of
yeah,
sort of indirect feedback. Then we're onto something interesting here, right?
yeah,
Mm,
absolutely.
mm.
So, but
There's a lot of
mhm.
in those kind of questions, right? So when if you're hearing cues about stuff, and I mean classical examples like this is like, oh well, I can't. Well, okay, well, so what can you do? If you could do something, what would that be? Or one example that I love is some people have a tendency of saying, I don't know a lot. So if you hear that picking up, well, okay, I hear you saying that you don't know, but what do you know then? Okay, wow, okay, that puts things in a different perspectives. Yeah, let's explore that. So just simple little questions like that, asking about the opposite, or maybe not the opposite, but at least a different angle on the wording.
Yeah, it's. I think a lot of that is about changing your mental processes. And I had a client last week who was talking about talking about a situation with someone in his team, and basically saying that, they were considering, can I do this? They were thinking about their ability. And, my three, the way to talk about things you're going to do, I can, I will, I want to.
Mm.
And it's interesting because he said, for him, it was, he asked this person, well, do you even want to, right?
Mm.
So, because if you have no desire to, then I mean, that's maybe where you should start before, telling yourself you can or can't do something. See if there's even desire for you to do it.
Mm.
And I usually go at it from the other direction. Can I even do it? Like, is this even possible for me? And then I look at whether I have the desire to do it. And then I look at, am I going to commit to doing it? But it just gave me an interesting. There are situations where probably it makes more sense to ask, first of all, do I even want to do this? Instead of taking on every challenge and seeing if I'm up to the challenge. There's just some things that maybe you just don't have the desire there to get it done. So anyway, even this is where we both know that even we get something out of every coaching conversation as well, right? So I found it really interesting to take a process that I apply fairly often and then have someone just put a small twist on it. And that for me was a benefit of seeing a different perspective.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I just on that I came across a really interesting guy recently as well. When we had a conversation, he told me about one of the things that he does or he used to do with his teams when he to change the perspective on them, and they were working in a very high paid industry, and they were there to create or to solve problems. Basically, it was a sort of the an IT company, but it was a really bad attitude in the team because there were so many problems and people were tired about it. So he kind of came up with this metaphor of two different kind of perspectives. Well, do you like to go to the candy store, or do you like to go to IKEA? And basically these perspectives was that IKEA, everything there is sort of standardized. There's one way of doing things. Things put together perfectly, and it's a standard solution for everything. You are high paid, well trained people, and you're better paid than everybody else because you're really good at solving problems. And where do you find the problems? That's in the candy store. Like, there's different kind of candies, and there's different kind of problems that you can deal with, and you can just choose what kind of problems you want to deal with first, and have a look at that. So he told me that story, and he sort of explained that to his team. And then, of course, they had a team meeting the day after or something, and some other stakeholder come on, we have this huge problem that we have to deal with. And he just looked at everybody. Well, so candy store or IKEA? And everybody's like, candy store.
Yeah. Well, sometimes the people get tunnel vision, and then when you make that shift, all of a sudden it's no longer a problem; it's an opportunity. There's all these chances to find solutions, and I think that's what makes it such a powerful tool. If you can just adjust the perspective you're looking at things from, it just kind of the world opens. And this is why it's funny when you are stuck on something and then you just sleep on it, and then what a difference a day makes. There's actually an old song from it's like an old jazz number, what a difference a day makes. And it's true, because sometimes that's what you need to have a change of perspective. You need to just walk away from something for a minute. And that's what when people are looking to make big life-changing decisions, I always recommend try and take a time out. Try to if you can take a weekend away, completely remove yourself from anything that could influence you or even remind you of the situation, and then don't think about it during that time. And then the answers tend to just come to you. And so and so that's when it comes to shifting perspectives. And you've already mentioned a few things. That's that's an interesting part about it. How do we get ourselves there? How do we get out of the perspective we're stuck in and shift over so we can see things from another angle?
Mm. Yeah, I guess we've talked about that because I started thinking about running.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's just one way to do it. But yeah, to just get and unwind, to get away from that state where this is when you're sort of feel obstructed or perhaps feel tied up by this problem or this perspective, and because and that's a little bit where we started this conversation as well, that how can we allow for different perspectives to emerge if you feel stuck in a situation. And that's also something we talked about last time, is feeling stuck. So
Yeah. Well, I think it's also, and I wish more people, there was a friend of mine who was a avid traveler. He did a lot of backpacking when I was still in Vancouver figuring out life, and he was out there seeing the world, my friend John, and he said to me once, every major politician in the world should be forced to spend a half a year backpacking, at least, maybe a year. And I think that's true. And I think that this is one of the things where people, when people come to an impasse, or people, I don't believe. There's a Canadian psychologist, Jordan Peterson, and I think he's brilliant in a lot of ways, but he talks about things in terms of there's so much malevolence in the world, right? The degree of malevolence, and I think that I take a much more optimistic, positive view of the world, and I think that there is far less malevolence, far less intentional apathy and intention to hurt other people than maybe you get from the news and different things. I think a lot of it is just not being able to appreciate the impact that we have on others, the negative impact, right? I mean, how many people do you know that would intentionally do something, even or go ahead and do something when they know it's going to hurt someone, or when it's top of mind, when they're conscious of the fact that the negative impact that it has on others? I think there are very few people that would do that. And, I know people in leadership positions are, forced to make tough decisions, but the average person, I don't think would consciously do that. And so I think this is another place where a shift in perspective, or exploring different perspectives, really comes into play, because sometimes politicians make decisions without being close to the constituents, or, heads of industry, if they living in the community where, water's being depleted or destroyed, or where the environment's being affected, or when politicians, if their kids have to go to the schools that are being affected by the budget cuts, or just whatever it may be, or some environmental catastrophe, and the company doesn't want to pay to clean it up, but if they were there to see the animals suffering and the people suffering and the ecological, if people were willing to confront themselves with it, they would. I'm confident they would have a shift of perspective, right? And it's just because we become so. Look, you and I talk to people about this all the time in big organizations with big hierarchies. At every level of the hierarchy, you have different perspectives. I think some of the most compassionate people are those middle managers who want to do right by their teams. They really want to, they're really concerned about the effects on people. And then you get, the higher up you get, the more you become concerned with shareholder value and, politics, strategy, all the maybe abstract things, and you lose touch with that human perspective. And so, you hear about these great leaders that will, they of companies that'll be able to know everybody's name. There's very few and far between now. But you'd have people that would really take pride in knowing their names of employees, do they have kids or not? Like all these different things. And I think when you remove yourself so far from the people or the situation, then it's hard to see things from that perspective. And I think that's what we need more of. And this is the problem that I see with a lot of the centralization of government authority or things like that. When you look at a country like Switzerland, this is one thing that, I've got family in Switzerland, but no, there's no perfect country. So I'm not advocating for, Switzerland's the perfect example, but the way their politics works is that, well, at least I was told that, people don't really care who the Bundeschancellor, like the leader of the country is. They're more concerned with who's the top politician in my canton, in my region. And because each of these regions has a lot of autonomy and a lot of power to make decisions. And so the politicians are closer to the decisions they're making. They're more held accountable. And so there's more thought put into, how's this going to immediately affect my region, not just sort of the big picture top line removed from all the everyday goings on. And so I think that kind of shift of perspective is super important. And I think it doesn't happen enough. You look in the U.S., they've got people in Washington who, people will say they're totally disconnected from what's happening in the rest of the country. And that's just one example. In Germany, you've got people sitting in Berlin, right? In Sweden, people sitting in Stockholm, but it's smaller geographically and population-wise, a smaller country. But I'm sure you have similar issues, right? The individual regions wish that the top politicians had more of a sense of what was going on in their communities, right? And so, I think these kind of things are really important in order to make better decisions. If you are in a position of power and ability to make change, facilitate change, and make those decisions, I think, being able to see things from multiple vantage points is so important.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, me and my wife had a discussion about that today. I mean, we today, what is it, November 28th, and there's a lot of riots going around in China, and we had this discussion like, how much does Xi Jinping know what's actually going on the ground? Perhaps, I mean, there is a possibility that he's so far away from everything, so people around him are not letting him be sort of aware of the situation. And then we started talking about sort of psychological safety in organizations, and the importance of transparency to allow for different perspectives. But if you have an autocratic system where there's no psychological safety and there's no room to, it's driven by fear, and you only want to hear one or two things, then how can you allow for different perspectives, right?
I think
so. Yeah. So that's and from, I mean, if we put that a little bit closer to us, I mean, now we're talking about very sort of geopolitics.
Yeah.
Geopolitics.
I'm not done yet. But finish your thought. I definitely have more to say on that subject.
Back to, I mean, say your own working organization. So how do you allow for different perspectives in your working surrounding? So, what kind of diversity do you have in your teams in terms of direct diversity or cognitive diversity? How do you allow for, I think we mentioned this as well, like this trick about having one seat in a meeting room that is dedicated to the client. So you always, well, what would the client say about this? So always allowing for that perspective, and other small stuff like that. Just being curious to explore what other perspectives might there be.
I couldn't agree more, and I think the whole diversity conversation, and I talk about this regularly when the topic comes up. What we need most of in diversity is really a diversity of ideas and different perspectives, and then we get a fuller understanding and picture of things. And so when it's all just superficial diversity, then because you can have people from different ethnicities and genders, and yet they're all very conservative. And you're not going to get a diversity of opinion in that group, or a very small range, right? So I think the diversity of perspectives is super important. and it just seems, as we look at things that are happening politically, but also what's in the news, everything seems so polarized. People, so many things are painted black and white. Right and wrong. These are the good guys. These are the bad guys. This is the right thing to do. This is the wrong thing. And I think that's concerning to me, because even a situation, you were just talking about geopolitics, but we in Europe here, we've got the situation in the Ukraine, and it's just so easy, and the media and everybody paints Putin as he's just a madman, and he's all these different things that they've basically put him in this box, and and I think that's not going to help us find a solution, because until you try and this is, I listened to a really interesting talk from a woman. It was on the Lex Friedman podcast. He does some brilliant work. Anyway, he was, and I'm, how I am with names. I'm drawing a blank on her name, but she was a negotiator, and she did a lot of work with Russia and in different situations. But she made a really valid point. She said, talking about, well, we have to have some empathy. If we want to find a solution, we have to have some empathy from where our opponent is coming from, and from what perspective they might be seeing the world from, right? So it's easy for us to say, on the surface of it, this is how it looks, move of aggression, obviously wrong from my perspective, but what, to all the news is saying, well, it was unprovoked. Well, maybe from our perspective, just like you have an argument with someone, you think, well, what did I do to deserve that reaction? Like even in intimate personal relationships, you can have that. And from that other person's perspective, you were rude or you were inconsiderate or whatever, right? And so you blow that up into geopolitical settings, and there could be a number of things that maybe they were good intentions, or they were innocuous, or maybe not so much, but people don't want to admit them. And then you say, well, that was completely unprovoked. So I think because let's face it, what Ukraine needs most, the Ukrainian people, is peace, right? They need peace. They need a chance to rebuild. They need, people want to get back to their lives. No more people want to die, right? So if we want to get to that goal of peace, then there's no way to negotiate a peace unless you can try and understand what the different perspectives are of the parties involved. And so it's become so controversial, but I think it's, seeing things from different perspectives and trying to say there's only one right way and one wrong way. I know ethically, for me, I'm against war in every way. And so I think there are always other solutions. In very few cases, there's a threat that can't be mitigated or negotiated with. But most of the times, and especially, how did you get here? How did you get into this conflict? Whether it's geopolitics or within a company or within personal relationships, we get so wrapped up in the emotions because we're unwilling to see things from the other perspective, and we're unwilling to even see how could we be perceived from an outside perspective. And this is why what we do in workshops is so valuable when we have like role playing or whatever, to have that observer, right? So you'll have two people practicing negotiations or practicing communication skills or practicing leadership, and those two people will have different perspectives, but how often in life do you have a third-party observer that can just kind of give you feedback, right? And so those things are super valuable. And so, I've kind of rambled on here, but I think...
I think it's very valid. And anytime it's a type of negotiation, we know that the most crucial skill is really to be able to actively listen and to understand the other person's viewpoint.
Yeah.
But in many cases, we're not even to get to the negotiation table because we're so locked into our own position. So then there's not an interest to explore different kind of perspectives. We're so far away from that. So maybe that's tying into the feeling about being stuck in one sort of position that you're not able to try to explore a different perspective.
And so I think extreme polarities are difficult, and I admit there are difficult. There are situations where it's really hard to see the other
Yeah,
person's
of course,
perspective,
yeah.
right?
Otherwise, it
Even
would
in the
be.
geopolitical ones that I mentioned, right?
Mm,
You know, we're talking about two political. You talked about China. I talked about Russia. So foreign for compared to the life we live and the political systems we live in.
mm,
But I mean, there are other situations, and this is, you know, I mentioned earlier in the conversation about Gabor Mate and the work that he does, but he's also gone into prisons, right, and
mm,
talked to these people, and then you find out the trauma they've experienced, right? So on the face of it, oh, this person, you know, in the worst case, killed someone else, right?
mm,
And how do you have any compassion or empathy for that kind of a person, right? But then you understand the trauma they've been through, the kind of generational dysfunction that's been in their families, the abuse they experienced, and then you can start, you know, you could, if you, once you start to look at it from that angle, from that perspective, then you can start to have some compassion, even though you wouldn't agree, or you would never even, you could not imagine yourself doing that thing that they did.
mm,
But how can you? You know, you didn't live their life. How can you
mm,
know and this is why there was a U.S. professor that talked about, you know, the at a very liberal college, and said, you know, if you were born in, I don't know, 17 whatever, would you, which side would you, and I can't remember, sorry, I can't even remember when the American Civil War was fought, but, you know, he basically asked, how many of you would be abolitionists? So basically getting rid of slavery, right? How many
mm,
of you and all the hands go up.
mm,
And at the end of the day, if you were living in those times, chances are a good percentage of people would come from families that had slaves, right? So
mm,
it's you're in denial about the, you know, the way things were back then, the way you were, and so to automatically label people as one thing
mm,
is just not even attempting to look at different perspectives without judgment, without saying, you know, there was anything right about because clearly slavery is a wrong thing, but
mm,
to have these different perspectives, or to just only see things through one lens of the way, you know, the way the world works now versus the way the world was 300 years ago, right?
mm.
So these are all important things to, you know, when we're trying to make sense of the world as a part of our sense making apparatus, to have these shifts in perspective is so
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, sure. Because I mean, I guess our rational brain wants to make things easier for us by simplifying, right? Because then we can maybe we talked about this before as well, but to make it complicated and to make it into a system where that we can understand and kind of make sense of, rather than being okay with the irrationality of a lot of things, and allowing from different lenses and paradigms, etc. So,
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's our biology, our
mm,
brain. You know, heuristics, the whole act of finding these shortcuts to save energy to make it all more manageable. I mean, we that's what's behind our biases, you know,
mm,
and the, you know, the assumptions that we make, and it makes life easier on average. You know, we can fit that in, but as soon as we change context, all of a sudden those heuristics don't work for us anymore, right? And
mm,
so yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize our limits in being able to see truth, to be able to, you know, to see things the way they are. It's so interesting when people think, well, you know, I believe it, I'll believe it when I see it, sort of thing, because as
mm,
if vision is the end all and be all. But I mean, if you look at things like, you know, the you know, spectrum of light that we can see is much smaller than like a bird, or, you know, and so if things are a color that we can't actually pick up, then we're not going to see it, right? So
mm,
and so we have lots of blind spots, and I think this is an important part of the conversation to have, is when we're talking about shifting perspectives, it's the acknowledgement that we have blind spots, whether it's because of our political beliefs,
mm,
or whether you know, the experiences we've had in life, or whether it's some form of trauma. There's just so many things that cause us to distort our view of reality, and we just don't, until we're confronted with something that's different, you know, we're not even aware of it.
mm. Yeah. So allowing for the curiosity when a new thought or a new idea hits you. Like typically, it sounds that either you say, "Oh, I knew it," or like to confirming that you're right. Right? But when something new comes in, it's like, okay, that's interesting. I've never thought about that before. What does that mean? And then being able to dig into that a bit. That's it's easy to say, but maybe difficult to do,
Yeah, but
as usual when we talk about that.
absolutely. Your point about curiosity is really important because when I think about when something sounds offensive, right? I'm not a person that's easy to get offended. There's some people who are super easy to offend, but when something offends us or even evokes this sense of disgust in us, right? It's 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 important, I think, to when someone has a view that's so extreme or so far removed from your own view. I think it's good to move to curiosity and go, even though there's no way I could ever agree with that, I just to have the curiosity to understand how does that person come to that conclusion.
Where does that come from?
Yeah. To try and see where's that, what vantage point are they seeing the world from, what lens are they seeing the world through in order to come to those kind of conclusions. And I think we're best served in using a degree of curiosity, not because we want to try and find common ground, because there's some people, I don't think I could find common ground with a fascist. I think there are probably things we would agree on, like there are certain values on, family values or whatever, maybe we could, but in terms of how a society should function or whatever, I don't think I could come anywhere close to that. But at the same time, to have the level of curiosity to go, well, how did they come to those conclusions? How is it possible that someone can see the world so drastically different from me? I think is a really healthy way to approach it. And now we, unfortunately, it's like, well, we can't hear these kind of, you're not supposed to platform certain opinions and so on. And I think you're going to have force those people underground and just let it fester and grow like a cancer, rather than letting people be heard, trying to understand and see where the source of that kind of dysfunction is coming from. And I don't have the solution, but I just think certainly limiting or kind of censoring speech is not the way to do it. So acknowledging different perspectives and trying to have the curiosity to figure out how they developed and where they came from, no matter how offensive they are to you, I think is really important if we're going to come to some, solutions, whether it's in our personal lives or geopolitically and everything in between, right?
Yeah, sure. And I guess just an example of how easily we are sort of lured into a different narrative in that sense I can't really think about a concrete example, but imagine a lot of action, sort of Hollywood action films, when you get to follow and you kind of cheer for the bad guys. There's a lot of these kind of movies, and you get to see how cool it is from the bad guys' perspectives, and then you're sitting there kind of rooting for the bad guys, and it's just like, well, from what lens do you want to see the story? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then all of the bad things that they're doing, that becomes sort of secondhand, and that's not so important.
Yeah, the sort of sympathy for the devil kind of
Exactly.
narrative, right? And I think the people will, we've come through a complicated couple of years, and whether it's politics or medicine or whatever, there's been real polarization of people. There are the conspiracy theorists, and then there's the absolute follow the established government, media, whatever. And there hasn't been I don't know if there's been as much nuance as I would have liked, but it's on either side. I think I can appreciate where people come from. I had some friends who don't want to or didn't want to they don't feel the need to investigate anything further. They just, what's told to them is what's told to them. But historically, governments have lied to their people and so on. But on the other hand, that you've got people who are the conspiracy theorists who are like, they gravitate to all the negative, and they see a conspiracy behind every
Right, everything.
coincidence that's out there. And
Mm,
so these extremes are, I think the extremes are the problem. And so if we had these two extremes exploring different
mm,
perspectives of the others, they might understand why, how they could communicate better, so that
mm,
there are less people who jump to those kind of conclusions, and with more transparency and so on. And if you had more transparency, you could be able to see things from different perspectives. So I think there's so many things we could be doing better in that regard to
mm.
reduce the amount of polarization and encouraging people to see things. But it almost seems like we're trying to win people convince them to our way of thinking, rather than one of the number one rules of listening, right?
Mm,
Is the letting go of the need to be right,
mm,
and such an important rule of communication.
mm.
If we could have more of that in the world, I think we'd be a lot better off.
Yeah.
Um,
No, but I mean, in our social environment, of course, we form subgroups around things, or topics, or ideas, or certain trends that appeal to us. And if it's the same kind of thing, I mean, we're drawn to people that think alike. But then, so it's we talk about this a lot in the working setting, that we need to have diversity, utilize that. But in our social environment, we really don't tend to do that very much, right? It's very rare that we seek up someone who thinks very differently from us, and, oh, let's hang out. But maybe that's something that we should just start doing a lot more.
yeah, and I think it's funny because I've heard some people in the scientific community talking about seeing things through a certain lens. So seeing things through an evolutionary lens, and that can be very legitimate. I mean, I don't dispute evolutionary theory. But to see everything as a consequence of that process, I think there is some limitation. As soon as you kind of you make restrictions, you leave something out, right? And so I think whenever you talk about things if you generally see life through a certain lens, I think that's a cue to go, okay, have I done enough work on looking at other perspectives, right?
Mm, yeah,
So
but I mean, I guess to argue with that, I think the purpose in the scientific world to do that is to allow exactly is to, well, what if I looked at it from another perspective? What if
mhm.
I looked at it from a different lens? So at least it's supposed to bring some color to that discussion, right? But I guess the purpose is very often to, well, then how can I more firmly suggest or define my point of view or my standpoint, right?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. I think for the most part, science is good at looking at different perspectives and trying to look at, take a systemic approach to things.
Mm,
I'm just thinking of a few cases where people are so invested in their theory of the world
yeah.
that they have trouble looking at things and so they're so invested in seeing things through a certain lens, a certain
Mm,
certain perspective, that they have trouble, stepping away and looking at it from another angle. And
yeah. Maybe
we've
that's what happens when a scientist become an influencer rather than a scientist.
exactly, and then it becomes dogma, not science anymore, right? And
Yeah.
that's the problem. But I think this is, I think we both agree on systemic principles, and one of the four key elements of the systemic approach is to change perspective.
Yeah.
Being willing and able to look at things from different perspectives, because for me that's still the single best way to solve problems holistically and to find solutions to source of problems rather than just the symptoms.
Mm.
So
Yeah. Maybe that's where we're going to end up with this. But it's interesting to see how it ties. And we could almost define coaching by exploring perspectives,
yeah.
because it's so relevant for what we do in coaching and what it's about.
Mhm.
So
And it's kind of at the heart of our podcast, the conversations we have, right?
I
Because
guess,
a lot of times one of us will throw out a topic and maybe we'll have a certain view on it, and then through the conversation we look at it from different angles. From maybe different theories that other people have or whatever, and I think that's what makes a good conversation, right? Exploring different perspectives is at the heart of like a lot of really interesting, and whenever you have this conversation with someone and you're able to say to yourself, oh, I hadn't thought about things like that before. Isn't that a satisfying
yeah, exactly,
moment,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And such an eye-opening moment. And so I think if anything, that's one of the best arguments for why it's important to have different perspectives and be willing to listen to people who have a different opinion from yourself.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
So cool. Okay. Well, yeah, that does sound like a good place to wrap it up. So I hope that our conversation has encouraged people to to be willing to listen to different perspectives, look at different life from different angles, vantage points. I think it just makes so much sense and helps us get a better, clearer view of the world. Hopefully with less hate and less animosity to one another, less polarization. I think we'd all be better off in the world if we had that.
Explore more. That's right.
Explore more. That's the theme for the day. Explore more. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for listening. Toby, thanks for a great topic and a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks,
and I think with that, that's a good thought. Everybody, explore more. Until next time, I'll leave you with that thought. All right. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
See ya. Bye.